Welcome to the Unlist. Today I'm going to be talking about a particular line of Chanel fragrances, specifically the men's releases of this particular line. It is the Allure Homme range, as the title card and the video description obviously spoils that for you. But the thing is, the Allure Homme range is more unique than people may realize within the larger catalog of Chanel, because it achieved a couple of firsts, and it does something that we will likely never see again from the brand. At least I wouldn't think we were likely to see it again. And those firsts are the first time Chanel would release a fragrance range that has a his and hers counterpart. So, as you may know, Chanel is a very traditional French house. They are actually maybe not the first, but the first successful designer fragrance house. And they play by basically the same rules that traditional French perfume houses play by, like Guerlain and Caron, Houbigant, where they don't have too many things that would be more, how do I say this, but more pushing the conventions, at least the conventions of French perfumery. And some of those conventions include releasing perfumes that have his and hers duplicates. You may know that Guerlain didn't really start doing that either until the 2000s, right? With the L'Instant de Guerlain range, his and hers. But it took Chanel just about that long too, right at the tail end of the 20th century. So Chanel actually did it before Guerlain did. But my point stands that not too many his and hers duplicates. Now, some of you guys are going to chime in and say, hey, wait a minute. Didn't Caron do a Pour un L a long time ago? Like way back in the, I think it was the 80s or 90s, like the feminine counterpart to Pour un Homme. And yes, you would be correct in saying that they did that, but there's also an argument to be made that Caron hasn't really been Caron since, well, I don't know, the mid 20th century, really. So it's one of the zombie houses, as I like to call it. You know, Felice Wanapulia hasn't been involved with Caron for a very long time. But whoever carries on the torch of Caron is doing so with very little to no guidance. Chanel, on the other hand, Chanel has really created its own orthodoxy over the years, which is why Allure Homme is so strange and that it breaks many of those orthodox rules. The first one being that it is effectively a male counterpart to the Allure range, which came out a few years before it. The second thing it does that Chanel doesn't really like to do and hasn't really done all that often and didn't really do all that often up until that point is have flankers. And again, I hear the people going, hey, wait a minute, what about the Eau de Cologne, Eau de Toilette, Eau de Parfum versions of number 5, number 19, number 22? You can count those as flankers if you want to, because they are essentially slightly different from each other. The concentrations give them a different smell, but they're not intended as flankers, themed flankers, where it's this fragrance sport, this fragrance fresh, this fragrance black, this fragrance, etc., etc., right? Chanel never really did that. And we saw the first inklings of that with the Egoist and Egoist Platinum releases, which again is on the men's side of the counter, right? With the reason behind that being that with the Egoist fragrance doing really well in the first couple years, but then kind of sloughing off after that, and ultimately being a sales disaster, never recouping the amount of money that was invested in developing it all throughout the 80s. Big debacle there. The fact that it was released under one name and then under a different name a few years later, da 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 da. So the Platinum Egoist was the recoup, effectively. It was the, we got to put something out that people are going to like and buy, that we can make money on, that we can recoup. And that really kind of became the first themed flanker, because Platinum Egoist, as it would get renamed, Egoist Platinum, Platinum Egoist, ended up really being a flanker of Egoist, but it did to Egoist what Drakkar Noir did to Drakkar, where it kind of made Egoist obsolete for a lot of people who weren't really feeling it to begin with. They just segued over to Platinum Egoist and then left Egoist behind. Us hardcore fragrance enthusiasts and us vintage nuts, we love the original Egoist. We kind of look at Platinum Egoist as too modern and too, I guess, too playing it safe. We like our dangerous and our loud and our crazy and our artistic, and we have all this built up romanticizing view of fragrances that's really a false narrative, honestly. So fragrances have always been commercial so long as they were released by commercial brands. Remember that. I don't care how artistic you think it is, or how artistic it may seem to you, or what the market copy tells you it is. If it's a commercial brand, it's a commercial fragrance. It was never intended to make a statement. We just read that into the stuff. Oftentimes, we read that into the fragrances after the fact, right? After their time in the sun has come and gone, and they're no longer popular anymore. Because they're not popular anymore, we've discovered them after that. We see them as something than what they really were ever meant to be. But with the Allure Homme range, you see, it was kind of very obvious that they were trying to effectively eat the lunch, if you will, of a lot of other designers who were doing that. A lot of American designers were doing that. Obviously, Calvin Klein was a big pusher of his and hers, starting that back in the 80s with his and hers Obsession and his and hers Eternity and Escape and all that stuff. And then the outright like unisex releases of CK1 and so on and so forth. So it was really popular to do his and hers releases. And even though Chanel, again, traditional, they stick to their conventional French design, but Chanel, at least from a perfume perspective, wasn't doing all that great by the end of the 20th century. Leading into the 21st century, leading into the 2000s, Chanel was kind of starting to fall behind, and other brands were doing way better. Obviously, Calvin Klein was knocking it out. A lot of American houses at that time were knocking it out. Italian brands like Versace and Armani were knocking it out too. And it was just like, well, come on, guys. We don't want to fall behind, because Chanel has always been in the top three, right? Right there with Dior. So they decided to kind of go against their better angels, right? They went against their normal way of doing things. Said, okay, well, we're going to make a his and hers release out of Allure, and then we're going to make flankers. You will notice, however, that with the Allure range, that the flankers kind of got further and further apart as time went on, and I think the emphasis and the effort on the range really kind of cooled down. It started to cool down. And this is due in part to Bleu de Chanel coming out. And Bleu de Chanel, for all intents and purposes, became the number 5 for men. It was their singular, iconic pillar release that had the toilette, the parfum, very simple, very iconoclastic packaging, very simple, some may say boring, but easy to like style. Like number 5 back in the day was a very easy like fragrance. Maybe not so much nowadays. It's over a century old, but century ago, it was a rather easy to like perfume. Bleu de Chanel effectively duplicated that same kind of success. But Allure, which had really began life as this sort of really keeping up with the Joneses sort of fragrance range, right? This whole when in Rome, right? It started to slowly evolve over time. And where it is now, it just has a very, very sort of different special place, in the overall canon of Chanel, especially on their men's fragrances. So let's get started with the first one, and I'll take you through all the releases because I have all the releases, with the exception of some of the limited ones. There were very limited ones that came out that I don't have. We'll talk about them, but they're not super important. Things first, we got the original. Now, some of you are going to scream, but this is not the original because it has the more modern cap. And yes, I know the vintage purists out there are going to say, oh, but it's not the deep vintage. The deep vintage bottle has got a smooth cap, doesn't have the ring around it, rah, rah, rah. And then they're going to talk about, oh, it's an entirely different fragrance. It's a shadow of its former self. It's unrecognizable. Da 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 da. I'm just like, shut the fuck up. You can do that on your channel. You're not doing that in the comment section of my channel. So you can do all that weird holy roller evangelical crap, about perfumes being magical. You can do that stuff on your channel. No, don't do it on mine. So this is, for all intents and purposes, a sort of in between a semi-oriental and really a semi-oriental and sort of a modern woody citrus fragrance, because it uses the typical plus Chanel aldehydes in the opening, and then it goes through this very sort of floral phase, and then it's got spices in it, and then ultimately it sort of ends up in this what I call the Polge sandalwood, because Jacques Polge, he had a certain sandalwood accord that he liked to use in a lot of his fragrances, especially in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And Mysore sandalwood had become very, impossible to use, especially in any quantity. So designers and big companies couldn't use it. There wasn't enough. So a lot of brands just used polysantol as a fill-in for real Mysore sandalwood, or they would adjoin a tiny bit of sandalwood with the polysantol. But Polge kind of decided to make his own accord, and I don't know the exact materials that go into it, but it's a very, it when you smell it, because it's in everything. It's in everything from Egoist all the way to Sycamore. Okay, so it's just a very iconic sort of house note that stands in for sandalwood, and I call it the Polish sandalwood because Jacques Polge created it. His son Olivier Polge continues to use it in stuff like Le Lion and all that, but you'll notice it in this fragrance very clearly. Now, other brands would riff off of this. You could say that YSL's L'Homme from 2006 was kind of a riff on this a little bit. But they're not one-to-one. I don't think they're really in the same wheelhouse, but it's the whole sweet, bright, a little bit spicy. The big difference is this doesn't really deal with any fruity notes, whereas the YSL has very big apple notes in it that you cannot miss. This doesn't have any of that. So the original concept for Allure Homme followed the same concept as the women's Allure, where it didn't have a top, a heart, or a base. It had this structure of quadrants. So as where the feminine Allure had 6 different uh, I guess, interlocking accords that are neither above nor below, but are all equal to each other. This kind of does that with four major blocks, and the market copy made a big deal about it, how it was not a structure like a normal fragrance and da 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 da. But let me tell you, this does actually have a normal top hard base dry down to me. When you spray this, you will smell an opening, you will smell a heart, you will smell a base. So whatever that equal quadrant or sextant thing, that was just BS basically. That was just bullshit. It's not actually how the fragrance smells at all. And yeah, older bottles were definitely richer. You know, older bottles were a bit heavier, but I kind of feel like the fragrance may not have necessarily meant to be that way because all the Allure fragrances have a certain uh, effervescent quality to them, a certain lightness to them. So the older bottles were much heavier on the sandalwood note, and that pulls them a little bit closer to Egoist. And I don't think you would really want another Egoist when there's still Egoist. You can still buy that. So why would you want another almost sort of also ran kind of fragrance that smells like that? You don't. So I can understand why they would tweak it and change it later. Now the next one up is Allure Homme Sport, and there's not as much to really say about this fragrance. It's a very well-known fragrance. I'm sure most of you out there have smelled it. You know the deal. Allure Homme was a good-selling fragrance, but by the early to mid 2000s, anything in the aquatic sphere was basically dominating the market. And even in the late 80s with Cool Water, all the way up through Polo Sport in the early 90s. But thanks to things like Aqua di Gio from 96 and then Polo Blue in 2002, aquatics just continued to steamroll. And they continued to steamroll. So it was like, hey, since Allure is the more designery range, right? Allure is the more commercial range with the flankers. They decided to go ahead and put out the sport flanker. And the sport flanker was, lo and behold, an aquatic. And it smells very similar to Aqua di Gio in a sense, very similar opening. It does have a bit of the original Allure DNA in it, but not a ton. And then it has a slightly sweet base with vanilla edging it off. You don't get too many aquatics with vanilla in them. So having vanilla in your aquatic really makes Allure Homme Sport stand out as a bit of a rounder scent profile than you'd expect from anything in this genre. And that's probably why it did so well. Other than that, you know the deal, right? Next up, we would see Allure Homme Sport Cologne that came out in 2007. So uh, there was a limited flanker that had a really long name, and that actually came out before Allure Homme Sport did. It was like a lighter, fresher, more sour take on the original Allure, and I feel like that was a market test. And that fragrance came out, and no one really liked it, and we never heard from it again. But that's the one I don't have, and it was originally a limited seasonal release. It was only sold for a single year, and it was done in the same sort of fashion that Bois Noir was done with Egoist. It came out, market test, no one liked it, went away. Allure Homme Sport became the fresh option, but they decided to make an even lighter fragrance with Allure Homme Sport Cologne. And I feel like uh, some of the idea behind this particular fragrance, from what I can see, is just they wanted to make a fragrance that was a little bit more uh, like an actual cologne that was focused on bergamot, focused on citrus notes, light white musks. And it doesn't have really anything to do with the Allure range. So I feel like the only reason why it got dumped into the Allure range and released as an Allure fragrance really just has to do with the fact that it was some pet project that Jacques Polish had lying around, and I feel like he wanted it out, but they weren't going to let him put it out as a new release. And this was way before we had stuff like Dior Homme Cologne. That wouldn't come out for a couple more years yet. So the whole idea of making like cologne releases as flankers wasn't really a thing in 2007. So if anything, you could say this kind of started that unintentionally, because it did sell well, obviously. You can still buy it. And it just kind of smells like a bright, fresh lemon, white musk. The kind of thing that MFK would release now, basically, but done by Chanel. The next one up is this. This is Allure Homme Edition Blanche. This is basically what you would get if you took the original Allure and spliced it back in with the Sport Cologne. So this takes the big lemon of the Sport Cologne and then brings it in with the Sandalwood, the benzoin, the heavier Allure Homme DNA, but keeps it bright with the lemon top in place of the aldehydes. A lot of people call this lemon meringue pie or something. I don't quite get that, honestly. I think it's more complex than that. But this was originally released as an eau de toilette concentrate, and that concentrate got discontinued. It came out in 2009. It got discontinued and replaced in 2016 with the eau de parfum version, but they're not really different fragrances. So if you have the 2009 eau de toilette concentrate or the 2016 eau de parfum, you basically have the same fragrance. Some of you, again, vintage guys, are going to battle me over that, and you're going to say one is completely different from the other. And I'm just going to be like, hey, out there, there's some grass out there. You can touch the grass. It's okay. So, just saying. Not mincing words over minutia. Then we have what was basically the last mainstream Allure Homme release for about 12 years. Yeah, 12 years. This came out in 2012. And this is the Allure Homme Sport Eau Extreme. So we had the original Allure Homme in 99. We had that short-lived, weird, limited flanker that, like I said, nobody has, no one smelled. I didn't have it. Then we had Allure Homme Sport in 2004, which was the first true main flanker added to the line. And then 2007, the Sport Cologne. 2009, the Edition Blanche. And 2012, we had this. But bear in mind, this was 2 years after Bleu de Chanel already hit the market. So the attention was now on Bleu de Chanel. All eyes were on Bleu de Chanel. So when you smell this fragrance, you really sort of feel like this was a aborted idea, that this fragrance could have been what became Bleu de Chanel, because this smells way more, again, conventional, smells more in line with what other brands were doing, not as original as Bleu de Chanel. So, not that Bleu de Chanel is all that original, it really isn't. It also kind of reuses and recycles some ideas, but you get a little bit of that ethyl maltol sweetness that started to come around with Gucci Guilty and Paco Rabanne Invictus and Versace Eros, which would come out the same year as this. But the difference is this is not full bubblegum. This is much more subtle, but that sweetness is still there. You can smell it. And this goes heavier on tonka. So you get more tonka, a little bit more sweetness. The Allure Homme structure that you remember from the original is here, but because you're getting rid of the aquatic elements effectively and you're putting in that more tonka base, it has much more of a nighttime sort of restaurant kind of feel. Or if you want to wear Allure in cold weather, this is a good cold weather option. This will actually power through cold weather better than the original. So if you're someone that wants to wear the Allure Homme range like all year round, summer, fall, winter, spring, you could do the Sport Cologne in summer. You could do the original in fall or spring. You could do the Sport in summer. You could do the edition Blanc in winter and probably early spring. And then this would be your dead of winter, cold, chill, frosty air. This would be that one. Which is weird because it's still fresh. Still has the fresh opening. Still has traces of the original aquatic vibe of the first Allure Homme Sport. But all of those really sharp ozonic aquatic aldehydes are gone from this. And you get the tonka instead and the sweetness instead. A little bit of the Polish sandalwood still here. Okay, so this is not a tonka bomb. Don't get it twisted. So this is still a woody fragrance, but woody in a much more gourmand way, I suppose. While still being like adjacent to a blue fragrance, adjacent to a fresh fragrance. It's bizarre, but it works. And it's the one that most of the like older school fans of the range, they hate that one. That's the one they hate the most. So I wasn't keen on it at first, but it's kind of grown on me. And now we have this, the Allure Homme Sport SuperLera, the first Allure Homme flanker in 12 years. Because like I said, 2012 was the last one. Then all the eyes became focused on Bleu de Chanel, Toilette, Parfum, or the Parfum. But they did give us another Allure Homme, and it's a sport flanker, so another sport flanker. There are now more sport flankers than there are flankers of the original, unfortunately. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, I guess. So this one is SuperLera. And I'm not sure whether you want to count this as a true flanker because it's marketed as being limited edition, since the SuperLera is a brand of coachwork. So they used to build bodies for sports cars, and then they transitioned away from that into tuning cars because no one really does bespoke coach work for cars anymore. Everybody manufactures their bodies now, but so they were coach builders at first, then they moved over to tuning cars, lightening them up, making them faster, etc., etc. So they teamed up with Chanel and made this flanker. And this does kind of smell like that. It is a punchier, drier, brighter, fresher Allure Homme, but it's also stronger. So it's both lighter and stronger. And it achieves that by having a very sharp, woody amber, sort of Sauvage-ish kind of, Aventus-ish kind of, you know the train of thought, right? That sort of sharp, sandpapery. You see it in Luna Rossa Carbon as well. You also see it in certain Mancera fragrances. God, you get it. It's in the Legend Blue. It's in the Versace Dylan Blue fragrance from 2017. So a lot of these like blue fragrances that have this sharp sort of sandpapery, woody, ambery element to them, this has that with patchouli. And the choice of heart notes also kind of make it feel a little more retro. Like just like I say the same thing with Versace Pour Homme Dylan Blue, that it feels like you take a 90s aquatic fragrance and you splice that 90s freshness with like that almost like a laundry sheets kind of freshness, and that's what a lot of 90s fragrances remind me of, laundry for some reason. But you splice that like 90s laundry sheets freshness with the more modern, strong, stiff woody amber base, and then you put all the blue notes on top. And there's a bit of allure in here. Again, this is more of a tangent, sort of like, again, with how the um, a lot of the flankers are really more of a tangent off the original. Very few of them resemble the original aside from the Edition Blanche. The Edition Blanche is the closest one to the original of all the flankers. But, yep. And this is also an eau de parfum, so it lasts a long time. And it's the most expensive Allure Homme flanker I've ever seen. So make of that what you will. This is premium dollar stuff, unfortunately. And some people say it's ridiculous. And I probably shouldn't have paid what I did, but I think if this does really well, when their partnership with SuperLera ends, they will probably relaunch this under a different name. So even though it's technically limited edition right now, this is probably going to sell too well for them to just chop it off and let it go away. It's probably going to return under a different name. So they tend to do that too, right? That's why Bois Noir became Egoiste, right? Because they wanted to re-release it under a different name. And it's also why a lot of other fragrances get subtle tweaks and changes, but the fragrance is the same. It's just the nomenclature changes. I have a feeling that's going to be the future of this. So there you guys have it, man. There's the Allure Homme range. Really different from most other Chanel ranges because it sort of defies Chanel convention by being more conventional, right? That's an oxymoron, but it's unconventionally conventional for Chanel, because Chanel is not a conventional brand, but this is their most conventional line, and it follows conventions that other brands established, and they have not done it before that, and they probably won't do it afterwards. So hope you enjoyed it, and catch